So last time we were with Jacob as he was fleeing his brother, and he had fallen asleep on the way. It was a very long journey. We had several nights away, but on one of those nights he dreamed and he saw the ladder that extended between earth and heaven, and we looked through that and thought about that last week. But in chapter 29 it begins, then Jacob went on his journey. So this just continues from where we left off. So Genesis 29 from verse 1. Then Jacob went on his journey and came to the land of the people of the east. As he looked, he saw a well in the field, and behold, 3 flocks of sheep lying beside it. For out of that well the flocks were watered. The stone on the well's mouth was large, and when all the flocks were gathered there, the shepherds would roll the stone from the mouth of the well and water the sheep, and put the stone back in its place over the mouth of the well. Jacob said to them, "My brothers, where do you come from?" They said, "We're from Haran." He said to them, "Do you know Laban, the son of Nahor?" They said, "We know him." He said to them, "Is it well with him?" They said, "It is well. And see, Rachel his daughter is coming with the sheep." He said, "Behold, it is still high day. It is not time for the livestock to be gathered together. Water the sheep and go pasture them." But they said, we cannot until all the flocks are gathered together and the stone is rolled from the mouth of the well. Then we water the sheep." While he was still speaking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess. Now as soon as Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, Jacob came near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and wept aloud. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's kinsman, and that he was Rebekah's son. And she ran and told her father. As soon as Laban heard the news about Jacob, his sister's son, he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him into his house. Jacob told Laban all these things. And Laban said to him, "Surely you are my bone and my flesh." And he stayed with him for a month. Then Laban said to Jacob, "Because you are my kinsman, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what shall your wages be?" Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were weak, but Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance. Jacob loved Rachel, and he said, "I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel." Laban said, "It is better that I give her to you than that I should give her to any other man. Stay with me." So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her. And Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife, that I may go into her, for my time is completed." So Laban gathered together all the people of the place and made a feast. But in the evening he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. And Laban gave his female servant Zilpah to his daughter Leah to be her servant. And in the morning, behold, it was Leah. And Jacob said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? Did I not serve with you for Rachel? Why then have you deceived me?" Laban said, "It is not so done in our country to give the younger before the firstborn. Complete the week of this one, and we will give you the other also in return for serving me another 7 years." Jacob did so and completed the week, her week. Then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife. Laban gave his female servant Bilhah to his daughter Rachel to be her servant. So Jacob went into Rachel also, and he loved Rachel more than Leah, and served Laban for another 7 years. What a story. Let's come to God in prayer before we start thinking of that a little more. Father, this is an unusual story in many ways. And yet, Lord, there's so much that we see that speaks of your dealings with your people, and it points to the Lord Jesus. We ask that you'll help us to see that through all the weird and strange things that are happening in this story. Help us to grow in our faith. Help us to grasp what you would say to us through this. And Lord, would all the words I say be truly reflective of your word and helpful for each one of us as we feed from your word today. Feed us, we pray, for your glory. Amen. So who watched the royal wedding yesterday? Maybe half? Who's seen images on the news? Has anyone not seen anything at all from the wedding? Well done. Quite an achievement, actually. It has been everywhere. I mean, there's so much focus and lots of people talking about it. Interesting in so many ways. There's a story that's come out today which has been, I think, kept a bit quiet, so not everyone knows about it, but about what happened when Prince Harry woke up this morning. Next to him was the woman that he married, who had strangely kept her veil on all night. In the morning, Harry thought a kiss was in order, and so he pulled up the veil, and to his horror, instead of seeing his beloved Meghan, he saw the face of her older sister, 53-year-old Samantha Grant. It's true, all true. At that moment, Harry's phone started ringing, and he reached over, and it was Meghan's father, who of course had missed the wedding, and now he was starting to piece together what he was really up to, somehow elaborately staging this thing that millions of people were going to see, and somehow swapping the bride over. I mean, realising what had happened, Harry answered the phone and said, "Oh, what is this you've done to me? Why have you given me Samantha as my wife instead of Meghan?" And the voice on the other end, in this clear American accent, said, "Well, it's not so done in our country to give the younger before the firstborn. But hey, give it a wake and you can have Meghan as well." I don't think that is true. I can't say categorically it's not true. I'm pretty sure it's not true. I have just entirely made it up. But made up based on this story that we've looked at. Yeah, it's definitely not true. It's just a crazy, ridiculous story, isn't it? And this is kind of what happened in Genesis 29. And whilst it seems ridiculous, as we dig into this story, we start to see kind of how it could turn out this way a little bit. But there's quite a big build-up before we get to that moment where he rolls over in the morning and suddenly realises he's got the wrong woman next to him. There's quite a lot of build-up. And in fact, for many verses, verses 1 to 14, are setting the scene quite a few years before it all happens, when Jacob first comes along to where his uncle Laban is living. And our first point this morning is true family. True family, because here we have, well, it's not a family reunion because they've not met before. Here's the point where family embrace each other, presumably for the first time. Maybe there had been some acquaintance before, but they weren't familiar with each other, certainly. But what Jacob was probably familiar with was the story of how his mother was found to be a bride for his father. Now, this is a story that we looked at in Genesis 24. Remember, Abraham's servant went along to the same area to find a wife for his son Isaac. And as we hear repeatedly in this passage, Jacob's mother, Rebekah, is the brother of Laban. And so, going to the same area in the east, we're told, Jacob goes along. And he comes to what would have seemed like a similar location. Maybe he was wondering if it was the same location. Probably he had in mind the story of how his mother had been found as a bride. It was, of course, a servant who'd gone along. It wasn't quite the same kind of scenario being repeated. But here was a well before him, and it was a well where the servant first met Rebekah. So maybe there's a link here. He goes along and he sees some men at the well, and they turn out to be shepherds, and goes along to speak to them. But as well as us seeing that there's some shepherds at that location, we're given some information, which seems like lots of information, that doesn't quite relate to the story about what happened at this well. In verse 2, he looked and saw a well in the field, and behold, the 3 flocks of sheep lying behind it. That's the flocks of sheep that belonged to these shepherds. And then we're just told the stone on the well's mouth was large, and when all the flocks were gathered there, this is just factual information about this location. When the flocks were gathered together, the shepherds would roll the stone from the mouth of the well and water the sheep, and then put the stone back in its place. Now, probably what's going on here, we're told this information because it's going to be relevant quite soon. There's a huge stone over the well's mouth, probably to stop thieves, maybe to stop contamination. And probably because the stone was so huge, they only wanted to move it once a day, just wait until everyone's there and then they'll get onto it. And as Jacob comes along and tries to find out what's going on and where he might find his family, he has this conversation with these shepherds. And from verse 4 to verse 8, we have this conversation. It's quite stilted, really. It's all pretty short phrases. My brothers, where do you come from? They said, we are from Haran. So, extra information at all. He said, do you know Laban, the son of Nahor? We know him. It's scintillating conversation, isn't it? I mean, if you ever want dialogue, then this is a great place to find some fascinating dialogue. Well, Jacob tries to get more out of them, and he says, well, is it well with him? And they said, it is well. And then to their relief, they can see Rachel coming along, and they think, finally, we're going to get rid of this guy. Look, that's Rachel's daughter coming along with the sheep. Go bother her, not us. But of course, Jacob still speaks to them, and he says, well, it's still high day. Is it not time for the livestock to be gathered? It is not time, he says, for the livestock to be gathered together. And they say, well, we cannot until all the flocks are gathered together and the stone is rolled from the mouth of the well. Then we water the sheep. Now Jacob had said, water the sheep and go pasture them. I suspect he sees Rachel coming along with the sheep and thinks it'd be much easier if these guys just go. It's not like they're going to butt in on the conversation or anything. They're not conversationalists, but it'd be a lot easier if they vanished. But that's just not the cusp. That's not what's going on. And Rachel draws near. And we're not told there was love at first sight. But as she comes along, I think we get the sense of a family connection being established. And as we move on in the story, we see verse 9, Rachel came, and then verse 10, as soon as Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother. I mean, you get the sense of family quite strongly, doesn't it? I mean, in my Bible, the way the lines are set out, it's just the same, 2 lines in a row. Laban, his mother's brother. Laban, his mother's brother. Well, she comes near, and Jacob came near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. Now, what's going on? He's just been told that they're waiting for everyone to come together, and we don't know if there's more to come or not. But Jacob just ignores that and just goes for it. He rolls the stone away and feeds the sheep of his cousin. It's hard to know. The Bible doesn't fully establish the reason why this detail is so important. But there seems to be a few things that we could get from this. Firstly, it demonstrates his great strength. I mean, this was described as a very large stone. Clearly it wasn't that easy to remove, or there wouldn't be this whole thing about waiting for all the sheep to be gathered together. But also, as well as demonstrating his great strength, which I'm sure he was keen to make a good impression as he sees his cousin along, and he wants to make sure he's in their good books at the very least. I mean, you might see her coming along and quite fancy her, but what's certain is that he doesn't want to get on the wrong side of family, as he's just come from a situation where he's running for his life because he's got on the wrong side of his brother. So he demonstrates his great strength, I'm sure making a good impression, and goes straight to water Rachel's sheep, or Laban's sheep as they actually are. But as well as showing great strength, it assumes a claim in the well. And in previous chapters of Genesis, we've seen that evidently wells were privately owned and often fought over. So who owns and who controls the well was probably a pretty important issue. And by taking control in this way, there seems to be a bit of a family claim that Jacob is making. And then he follows this in verse 11 by kissing Rachel. Jacob kissed Rachel and wept aloud. I haven't checked every reference to kissing in the Bible, but I'm told that this is the only reference to a man and a woman kissing who aren't married in the Bible. Now, clearly there's plenty of it that goes on, because there's plenty of ill behaviour that goes on in the Bible, but certainly in terms of mention of kissing, this is the only time we're told that a man and a woman kiss who are not married. I won't necessarily try and draw out a strong life lesson on that one, right? But it's interesting. I don't think it necessarily means that there was a romantic connection already. Because in a couple of verses, he does exactly the same to his uncle. This is certainly, at the very least, a family connection. And he kisses Rachel and weeps aloud. In verse 12, he tells Rachel that he was her father's kinsman and that he was Rebekah's son, and she goes and tells her father. And so verse 13, Laban comes along. He runs to meet him, embraces him, and kissed him, and brought him to his house. And we're told Jacob told Laban all these things. All what things we're not really told, but we can imagine certainly part of the story of why he's come along, or something along those lines, he's telling him about. In hindsight, maybe he tells him too much. Because actually Laban isn't someone who can be trusted. He may be family, but he doesn't turn out to be the most trustworthy person. And as warm as the welcome seems to be, there's maybe some hints in the text that there's something a little bit amiss. See, Laban runs to meet him. I wonder when he comes and arrives and meets him whether his heart sinks a little bit. Because it isn't quite all that he hoped for. If you've got your Bible, just flip back to chapter 24, which is when the servant of Abraham has come to maybe exactly the same place, or maybe just a very similar place in another well nearby. But in chapter 24 and verse 29, so the servant of Abraham has come along, and he wants to state that he's looking for a bride for Isaac. And we read from verse 29 of chapter 24, Rebekah had a brother whose name was Laban. This is the first time we meet Laban. We start to see what kind of man he is here. Laban ran out towards the man to the spring. As soon as he saw the ring and the bracelets on his sister's arms, and heard the words of Rebekah his sister, thus the man spoke to me, he went to the man, and behold, he was standing by the camels at the spring. He said, Come in, O blessed of the Lord. Why do you stand outside? For I prepared the house and a place for the camels. So the man came to the house and unharnessed the camels, and gave straw and fodder to the camels, and there was fresh water to wash his feet, and the feet of the men who were with him, and the food was set before him to eat. So much is described in terms of the hospitality of Laban in that case. And Laban isn't even the man of the house, I mean his father is. And the man before him is a servant. But it specifically says he responds in such a way because he sees all the jewels. And along comes Jacob, and maybe he runs to meet him because, well, last time someone from that family came along, it was pretty good, pretty profitable. He comes and sees Jacob, and there's no camels, there's no jewelry, there's nothing. He's just a man who has just about made it. Maybe warning bells wouldn't be going off for Jacob, but as we look back, knowing what follows, maybe the welcome wasn't quite as warm. Because actually, what follows shows us that as this family gathered together, there's maybe too much of a family likeness. See, what have we known about Jacob so far in his story? Well, he specialises in deception. His name is even linked to the word deceit, or deceiver. Jacob is a deceiver, and his mother even more so. His mother has orchestrated the things that have actually gone horribly wrong and caused Jacob to have to flee. But maybe he should have been a little bit more wary of someone who is related to his deceitful mother. I mean, maybe deceit doesn't always run in the family, but maybe he should have been a little bit cautious. Because here, Jacob the deceiver comes into the arms of the master of deceit, Laban. See, there's a strong family likeness, and maybe we just get to start to see a little hint of it here. There may have been other ways. You see, in verse 14, Laban said to him, "Surely you are my bone and my flesh." And he stayed with him for a month. I mean, there's an embracing of family likeness there, isn't there? Maybe there's a likeness in appearance. There's certainly this likeness in the circumstances where they encountered the person who's going to end up as the bride. But most certainly there's a likeness in character. Jacob and Laban standing next to each other, there's a likeness between them, maybe in appearance, almost certainly in their character, a character that is prone or has been prone to deceit. I wonder for us, do we have a family likeness? I always try and avoid, I was given a tip as a younger man that I shouldn't really give illustrations that would potentially embarrass any of my children. Just this once, I will. I'll pick on Benjamin. He knew it was coming. When he was a tiny little baby, it was just a real joy. I mean, this was our experience, first child, and so pleased when everyone gives him attention and sees him, looks down at him, and says, "Oh, he's so beautiful. Oh, look at him, he's so beautiful." And they do what everyone does when they see a baby. They try and work out who they look like. And they look at him, "Oh, he's so beautiful. Oh, he looks like his father." I don't know that they meant it as a compliment, but I always took it in that way. We do look for family likeness. And, well, I won't comment on whether that's true today of myself, but whose likeness do we bear? Do we bear a family resemblance in terms of our earthly families, or do we bear an even stronger resemblance to our Heavenly Father? When people see us, what do they see? When people see our character, what does that reflect? Does it reflect the kind of line that we've come from? Well, that seems to be true of Jacob. He seems to be coming from a place of deceit. And in our family histories, there's going to be all kinds of traits, some which are fantastic and some which would rather not be carried on. When people see us, whose likeness do they see? Do they see simply a product of the biological family we came from? Or do they see a resemblance to our Heavenly Father? Oh, let us make sure we are bearing a likeness to our Heavenly Father. Well, that's our first point, true family. We see this true family coming together. They really are like in so many ways. But our second point is true love. True love. And we know we're heading towards a wedding. I mean, we want to see true love, don't we? And many people have commented on the royal wedding yesterday just how in love they seem to be. Of course, most people can only see what it appears to be, but I mean, often you can see some genuine looks of love, and that's what many people have been looking at, a real look of love. And there seems to be true love going on here in chapter 29 of Genesis, when Jacob falls in love with Rachel. But Verse 15 tells us that Laban said to Jacob, because this is after him being there a month, because you are my kinsman, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what shall your wages be? Now we know that Laban is crafty. And Laban knows why Jacob is there, to some reason at least. It may have been something that Jacob had told him, or it may at least be the case that he's noticed him looking at one of his daughters. But Laban, may be leading to a certain point, says, well, you can't be working here for nothing. I mean, you have for the last month, but you can't just be working here for... Let me offer you, what would you like? What would you like? And in verse 16, there's no hesitation in Jacob's mind. He knows what he wants. And we were told Laban had two daughters. The name of the older was Leah, the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were weak, but Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance. This is the background to what was facing him. There was two daughters in the house. The older was Leah, the younger was Rachel. And we're told Leah's eyes were weak, or in his translation it's got a footnote to say or soft. I don't know that this is necessarily meant to be a negative description of Leah. Soft eyes would mean equally kind of soft and beautiful. If it was simply saying she's got kind of weird eyes or something like that, it's quite a strange contrast to then make to Leah, to Rachel, who was beautiful in form and appearance. I don't know. Maybe because eyes are important in beauty. I think maybe it means that she had beautiful eyes. But Rachel, certainly in Jacob's eyes, and beauty is in the eye of the beholder, isn't it? But for Jacob, Rachel was the beautiful one. Rachel was the one beautiful in form and appearance, in her form, in her stature, which is probably not the kind of the ideal of beauty that seems to get portrayed these days, incredibly thin and whatever. I mean, she was a strong shepherdess. And Jacob saw her and liked the image he saw. And verse 18 tells us that Jacob loved Rachel. Jacob loved Rachel, and it goes on to say, and he said, I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel. What Laban has said is that you shouldn't work here for nothing. What can I give you? And he says, well, tell you what, I'll work 7 years if I can marry your daughter. The fact that Laban doesn't even try and barter with him, or anything, he doesn't try and change, that's a pretty good offer. That's a pretty solid offer. And, well, it reflects something very strong in Jacob, doesn't it? Jacob is in love, we're told, and he's willing to pay such a price. Now, it might have been that Laban had already dropped hints of what kind of dowry he would expect. But here he is agreeing for 7 years of work for Rachel's hand in marriage. This is true love. Love that is truly patient. You know, very few people today would find waiting 7 years acceptable. And probably back in those days it would have been true as well. Waiting 7 years. But here we find love that waits, love that is patient. And not just patient, but is sacrificial. 7 years of working. And this will later turn into 14 years, but he's willing to give it because of his love for Rachel. And true love is always sacrificial, because love cares more for the other person than self. That's what love really is, isn't it? Now, in truth, our love, our human love, is imperfect, and we hold on to the things of ourselves, which is why 7 or 14 years is incredibly impressive, to wait that long, to work that long for the sake of love. It is quite an impressive thing. It does reflect very strongly about the love of Jacob, but of course, even greater love than that has been shown by God in sending Jesus. For 7 or 14 years, pales into insignificance compared to the sacrifice of Christ, ultimately sacrificing his life through the death on the cross. So that's real love. And yet we see here in Genesis 29 this love of Jacob. A love that is beautiful and points towards it. And in verse 20 there's this beautiful statement, isn't there? So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her. It's beautiful and it's romantic, isn't it? 7 years and they just seem to pass by because he loves her so much. And that reflects the attitude and the heart of Jesus, doesn't it? The cost that he was willing to pay because of his love for us. There's a line in How Great Thou Art that I always find slightly hard. Do you know the line that on the cross my burden gladly bearing? It's the word gladly that I don't particularly love. Because I don't think there was gladness as he suffered on the cross. He wasn't there thinking, oh, I'm glad I'm here. And yet, it's hard to find a word that is completely suitable there. Because it's more than just a simple willingness, isn't it? You see, there was so much love that he was feeling for us that the cost never seemed too much, and he was willing to pay because of the gain. I'm not sure gladly bearing is the right words, but I don't know what words would best describe that feeling that he would have that was so full of love that it was a price worth paying. And it's pointed towards here, isn't it? In this love, this beautiful love of Jacob for Rachel. A love that meant 7 years just seemed like a few days. You know, when we get into the next part of the story, he has to wait 7 days after marrying Leah for Rachel. I wonder if those 7 days seemed longer than those 7 years. Well, back one verse to verse 19. When Jacob had said, I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel, verse 19, Laban said, it is better that I give her to you than that I should give her to any other man. Stay with me. Laban can see this love that Jacob has for Rachel. And as the master deceiver, he knows how to manipulate the situation. And he gives an answer that doesn't actually quite confirm the request. It certainly says enough to make Jacob feel that that's what he's agreed to, but he doesn't quite agree it in words, certainly in what we read here. And it points towards our third point, which is true deceit. We go from true love to true deceit, verses 21 to 30. 21 to 30, true deceit. And this is where the story's been building up to, isn't it? Because in verse 21 we get to the time of the wedding, and Jacob says to Laban, give me my wife that I may go into her, for my time is completed. Those years that have gone by just like a few days because of his great love for Rachel, for his anticipation of what's going to follow, they're up. He gets to that point where now finally he can marry. But of course, Laban had 7 years to plan how to get away with the great deception that he's been planning. Because why have Jacob for just 7 years when he could get maybe another 7 years out of it? In verse 22 we read, Laban gathered together all the people of the place and made a feast. And if we read about a feast, almost certainly that's going to include a lot of alcohol that he probably keeps topping up for Jacob. Make sure he has a full glass at all times. 7 years is a long time to make sure he's designed an elaborate veil to make sure true identity is not necessarily all that apparent. And well, verse 23 we read, in the evening he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. We don't get details of quite how marriages worked and whether there was any kind of exchange of vows or anything. It certainly had something that we have in most marriages today, which is the father gives away the bride. And he gives him Leah. And verse 23 tells us that this wedding was consummated. Verse 25 brings us to the next morning. In the morning, behold, it was Leah. Behold, it was Leah. I mean, it just really blows the mind. And you have to feel quite sorry for Leah, I think. Next time, in the next passage that we're in, we'll look more on Leah and her situation. But although she must have been complicit in some kind of way, she would have done so under her father's authority. And to be so quickly rejected by this husband, it must have been awful for her. And verse 25, that rejection is made evident so quickly. In the morning, behold, it was Leah. And Jacob said to Laban, "What is this that you've done to me? Did I not serve with you for Rachel? Why then have you deceived me?" And Laban replies in verse 26, Laban said, "It is not so done in our country to give the younger before the firstborn." And that must have stung. Because suddenly he's confronted with the system of the older having the first rights. And of course, what's been causing the problem all back at home? It's him trying to seize the rights of the older. Of course, the ironic thing is, God had promised him those rights. He didn't have to deceive his way to get them. And yet that's what he does. And suddenly he's confronted with something that feels like a punishment to suit the crime. Here the deceiver has been deceived. And his whole background of usurping his brother has come rushing back to him, catching up with him. Oh, it's not Esau catching up with him and murdering him. But it must have stung pretty hard. The deceiver has been deceived. In Matthew 26, verse 52, we read Jesus saying, "All who take the sword will perish by the sword." Possibly using an existing proverb. Often hear it, "All who live by the sword will die by the sword." Or what goes around comes around. Is that the right way around? Or comes around, goes around? It goes around, comes around. Something like that. So often things do catch up on us. And often I think that's God allowing it to happen in order to discipline his children. Allowing natural causes to gather together so that his children, Jacob in this case, and us in other cases, may be humbled. And in verse 27, well, we see the motive for the con being revealed. Verse 27, Laban says, "Complete the week of this one." He's talking about her like she's a product, isn't it? It's horrible. "Complete the week of this one, and we'll give you the other one also. In return for serving," it doesn't quite say, but in return for serving me another 7 years. This is where we get the title of the sermon, "Two for the price of two." Why only have one bride for one price of 7 years? You can have two for two. It's awful. The attitude of Laban, who treats his daughters like they're commodities. But this is Jacob's humbling happening, which God is allowing, possibly as a form of discipline. And what happens is a problematic, dysfunctional family is formed. Back in verse 24, we learn that Laban gave his female servant Zilpah to his daughter Leah to be her servant. And then we read in verse 28, Jacob did so, he completed the week. And Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife. And Laban gave his female servant Bilhah to his daughter Rachel to be her servant. So Jacob went into Rachel also and loved Rachel more than Leah, and served Laban another 7 years. But Laban knew he was going to get away with it because how great the love of Jacob was for Rachel, that he, once having completed the first 7 years, he's going to go for another 7 years just to get Rachel. But what we're left with is a man with 2 wives and 2 female servants who essentially become concubines going forward. See, what happens through the deceiver being deceived is the creation of this dysfunctional family, and yet this also provides a significant step forward towards the nation of Israel forming. Because from these 4 wives and concubines come the 12 tribes of Israel, don't they? Between them, one of those 4 have children who are among those heads of tribes. And we see there that whether through discipline or for other reasons, when we make those messes, God takes those messes that we make and uses them for His purposes. It is a wonderful thing how God can take those messes that we make and use them in wonderful ways. But it doesn't give us a license to make messes, of course, does it? And for Jacob, I don't think he ever looked back and was glad for making such a mess and allowing himself to be in a situation where he would be deceived by Laban. As far as we can see, it was only the very last few years of his life living in Egypt that the effects of his broken family not cause him problems, and by that stage Rachel had long died. And yet praise God that He does use our messes when we do mess up, and we will mess up, and we will do it again and again. But He uses our messes, but let's strive to not get in the first place. Let's strive to not be making messes. Let's strive to be those who can learn from the lessons of people like Jacob. And avoid those situations. Honouring God in our actions, honouring God in every way. That He might be glorified. That He may be using His good means to bring about His purposes. Let's pray. Father, we thank You that You do use our messes to bring glory to Your name as You fulfill Your purposes. But Lord, we pray we'll be those who can learn and can grow, and that You'd use wonderful, God-honouring means to achieve Your purposes in our lives. Help us to learn from Jacob. And Lord God, we ask that as well as learning from that bad quality of kind of this family line of deceit, as well as learning from what we shouldn't do in Him, help us to learn something from His love as well. As we see that incredible love that He had for Rachel, help us to learn from that, and ultimately learn from the love that You have, and be those who love each other, and even more so love You with all our heart, with a willingness to be devoted, the willingness to give everything, a willingness to put self last, that You might be first. Help us to love with that beautiful love, we pray. Amen.